west was wild, but nothing prepared Deadwood for the howls. Cattle torn to shreds, trails of blood leading into the shadows, whispers of a hairy devil. When lawmen turned tail, they called on a legend, Wild Bill Hickok. He'd faced every outlaw, but could the fastest gun in the West survive a monster that laughs at lead bullets? This isn't just a Western. This is where legends meet nightmares. The dawn of August 1873 painted the Deadwood wilderness in hues of bruised purple and awakening gold, a familiar, comforting masterpiece to Elias Vance. For 30 years, he'd coaxed life from this unforgiving land, carving out a ranch where the pines met the sprawling grasslands. He knew the bite of the wind, the cry of the hawk, the distant murmur of the Spearfish Creek. He knew the rhythm of the wild. But this morning, a different sound hung heavy in the air, the unsettling absence of a sound. No chirping birds, no rustle of squirrel in the ponderosa, just a deep, profound silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Elias, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked lines and quiet resilience, had woken with a prickle of unease. His prize steer, Old Bessie, a docile creature with wide, trusting eyes, had been missing from the herd since before first light. Not like Bessie to wander far. He'd grabbed his well-worn rifle and set out, the rising sun casting long, deceptive shadows across the dewy grass. His boots crunched on pine needles, each step echoing in the oppressive quiet. He found her in a small clearing, nestled between a cluster of ancient firs and a rocky outcrop, or rather what was left of her. The sight stole the breath from his lungs, colder and sharper than any mountain air. Old Bessie wasn't merely dead. She was ruined. Her massive body lay twisted at an impossible angle, limbs splayed, flesh ripped away in great gaping swaths. Bone gleamed sickeningly white through the crimson devastation. This wasn't the work of a pack of wolves, neat and efficient. Nor was it a grizzly, which would leave distinct claw marks and a partial carcass to return to. This was something else. The sheer, savage power required to inflict such damage was unthinkable. Her head, still remarkably intact, lay turned towards him, one eye staring blankly at the sky, filled with a last, silent horror. Elias's grip tightened on his rifle, his knuckles white. There were no distinct tracks, no clear paw prints in the damp earth around the carcass, only churned soil and the deep, dark stains of life spilled. A faint, musky scent, foreign and unpleasant, hung in the still air, not the usual smell of predator or prey. This was a violation, an act of pure, unbridled destruction. A primal fear, cold and heavy, settled in his gut. He'd seen plenty of death in his years, men, animals, the unforgiving land itself. But this was different. This was wrong. It felt like a tear in the very fabric of his familiar world, a gaping wound that promised more than just missing livestock. As he turned, his gaze sweeping the tree line, he saw it. A faint, almost invisible trail of blood leading away from the carnage, deeper into the thick, dark woods. It promised answers, and Elias wasn't sure he wanted to find them. The chilling news of Old Bessie's demise traveled faster than a prairie fire across the parched summer plains. By mid-morning, it had already reached the handful of scattered ranches, converging on the dusty main street of Deadwood's outskirts. The general store, usually a hub of quiet commerce and gossip, hummed with a different kind of energy that day, a low, anxious murmur. Men gathered, their voices hushed, their faces etched with a blend of curiosity and growing unease. Elias Vance, his usual quiet demeanor now tinged with a raw, undeniable fear, recounted his discovery. He described the impossible wounds, the sheer, brutal force, the lack of discernible tracks. "It warn't no bear," he insisted, his voice raspy, his gaze meeting no one's directly, lost somewhere in the horror of the memory. And no wolf pack neither. This was bigger, stronger, and cruel. Among the gathered was Jedediah, Jed Cooper, a younger rancher, broad-shouldered and quick to anger. his youth lending him a dangerous confidence. "Sounds like them damn Blackfoot again," Jed spat, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Creeping in from the hills, looking to scare us out. We ought to form a posse, ride out there and teach 'em a lesson." His words, though fueled by rage, held a familiar ring, a common enemy to blame. Martha Thorne, the stern but kind proprietor of the general store, wiped down her counter with a methodical slowness that betrayed her own simmering worry. "Jed, don't be spouting such nonsense," she reprimanded, her voice a low contralto that usually quelled disputes. "Indians don't slaughter cattle like that. They take what they need and they move on. This sounds like a sickness." She wrung out her cloth, glancing at the worried faces. Her concern was practical. Fear kept folks home, and home meant no trade. But Elias shook his head slowly. "No sickness, Martha. This was done with a purpose. A wicked purpose." He tried to explain the visceral wrongness of it, the feeling that permeated the air, but words failed him. He'd seen bandits work, seen wild animals kills. This was neither. The sheer devastation of the carcass, the bone-deep terror etched into Bessie's lifeless eye, haunted his waking thoughts. A few grizzled prospectors, their faces weathered like old leather, sat slumped at a dusty table in the corner, nursing their whiskeys. They'd heard of similar incidents in distant, wilder territories, often dismissed as campfire tales. Now those whispers felt closer, sharper. "Could be an unusually large cougar," offered one, but his voice lacked conviction. The discussions grew heated, then fell into uncomfortable lulls. The seed of fear planted by Elias's grim discovery was taking root. It wasn't just a lost steer, it was an unknown threat, one that defied easy explanation. The initial skepticism was giving way, slowly but surely, to a deeper, more unsettling suspicion that something truly monstrous had entered their isolated corner of the West. And as the sun began its descent, casting long, nervous shadows across the main street, each man and woman felt the chill that had first gripped Elias. What if this was just the beginning? For the next few weeks, an uneasy truce settled over the Deadwood outskirts. The ranching community, despite their lingering anxieties, tried to resume their routines. Cattle were kept closer to home, corrals reinforced, and rifles were never far from reach. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves in the night seemed amplified, drawing out nerves stretched taut as fiddle strings. The sun continued to rise and set, painting the hills in familiar colors, but the landscape felt subtly altered, as if holding its breath. Then came the full moon. It rose, a fat, luminous pearl hanging heavy and low in the inky black sky. Its light, usually a gentle balm, felt strangely intrusive tonight, casting stark, unsettling shadows that danced with phantom shapes. The air grew still, the wind dying to a whisper. It was the kind of night that prickled the back of a frontiersman's neck, a night of ancient primal energy. Elias Vance, unable to sleep, sat on his porch, rifle across his lap, watching the pale light illuminate his fields. Jed Cooper, too, paced his ranch yard, his brow furrowed, a shotgun clutched tight. Martha Thorne had locked her general store an hour early, double-barring the door. All across the scattered homesteads, lamps burned late, and anxious eyes peered out into the moonlit expanse. And then it came. It began as a low, mournful moan, a sound that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, vibrating through the bones. It swelled, growing in volume, deepening in pitch, until it ripped through the stillness of the night like a tearing canvas. It wasn't the sharp, piercing cry of a lone wolf, nor was it the guttural roar of a grizzly. This was something else entirely. It was a terrifying primeval sound, a howl filled with such savage hunger, such raw, unbridled fury, that it sent a cold spike of ice straight into the heart. It echoed, a prolonged, chilling declaration of dominance and bloodlust, bouncing off the distant hills and rolling through the valleys. It was too deep, too prolonged, too intelligent for any known beast. Elias felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming wrongness of that sound. He heard it. Jed heard it, and countless other ranchers, huddled behind their locked doors, heard it too. The howl seemed to vibrate in their very souls, a signature of the terror that now stalked their lands. The next morning, the extent of the horror became sickeningly clear. Not just one, but 3 more cattle lay butchered across 2 different homesteads, their injuries mirroring old Bessie's, impossible, savage, devastating. One carcass was found half-dragged into the tree line, leaving a sickening trail of fresh blood and splintered branches. But there was another discovery, one that twisted the knife of fear deeper into the community. A small, bloodied leather collar lay discarded near the mangled remains of Jed's favorite tracking dog, Rusty. Only the collar remained, a stark, gut-wrenching testament to a swift and brutal end. Rusty was gone, utterly consumed. The casual, terrifying ease of the kills, the total disappearance of the dog, confirmed it. What roamed their wilderness wasn't just hungry. It was monstrous, and it was getting bolder. The discoveries of the morning after the full moon shattered any lingering illusions of normality. The cattle, the dog, the horrifying howl that still resonated in the quiet corners of their minds. It was undeniable. This was no ordinary predator, no band of human raiders. Panic, raw and unbridled, rippled through the Deadwood outskirts. Men stood in tight, anxious knots, their faces pale, their eyes darting towards the ominous line of the forest. Women clutched their children tighter, whispers replacing laughter in their homes. Jed Cooper, his youthful bluster replaced by a stark, desperate fear, no longer spoke of vigilantes. He stared blankly at the spot where Rusty's collar had been found, a grim understanding settling upon him. Even Martha Thorne, ever practical, wrung her hands, her thoughts far from trade. Who would buy supplies? Who would stay? When death stalked their doorsteps, defying sense and reason. It was in this atmosphere of profound desperation that the old-timers, usually dismissed as purveyors of tall tales and forgotten lore, found an unlikely stage. They weren't gathered in one place, but their warnings, borne on the wind of fear, began to circulate. One was an old prospector named Silas Blackwood, a man whose face was so carved by sun and wind, he looked like a living map of the Rockies. He sat outside the saloon, whittling a piece of wood into nothing, his eyes, surprisingly bright for his age, fixed on the distant hills. "Been hearing tales like this since I was a pup," he rasped, his voice gravelly, "from folks who lived even wilder than us, up in the mountains, down in the canyons. They called it the shadow hound, or the timber ghost. Always came with the full moon, always left naught but ruin." He paused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "They said normal lead just makes it laugh." Further out, in a small, isolated camp near the creek, lived an elder of the Lakota Sioux, a quiet man named Chayton. He rarely ventured into the white man's settlements, preferring the solitude of his ancestral lands. But stories of the hairy devil had reached even his ears. He spoke to a young, more open-minded rancher who had sought his wisdom, of ancient spirits, of skinwalkers and shadow beasts. "The forest remembers things," Chayton said, his voice low and rhythmic like a drumbeat. "Things older than man. Some creatures walk between worlds. They are born of darkness and hunger, and they are not stopped by simple iron." He spoke of specific weaknesses, of the need for purity and sacred metals. Words that sounded like pure superstition to the modern ear, but now resonated with a chilling possibility. These tales, once quaint diversions, now took on a terrifying gravity. While some still clung to the hope of a giant wolf or an unknown bear species, the majority felt the cold dread of something truly supernatural. Elias Vance, listening to Silas's words, felt a shudder run through him. The old-timers had always been seen as eccentrics, their wisdom rooted in a forgotten past. But now, their hushed warnings, their cryptic descriptions of a beast immune to conventional weapons, offered a terrifying explanation for the impossible carnage. It was a terrifying answer, but an answer nonetheless, and it solidified the chilling realization: They were dealing with something utterly inhuman. The terrifying tales from the old-timers, though unsettling, offered a strange kind of clarity. What stalked the Deadwood wilderness was not of this world, or at least, not of any world they understood. This was beyond the reach of local law, a handful of deputies who were more accustomed to breaking up saloon brawls than facing down a monster that scoffed at lead bullets. Fear had curdled into despair, and desperation birthed a radical idea. The community gathered in Martha Thorne's general store, their faces drawn and grim in the flickering lamplight. Elias Vance, usually a man of few words, spoke with a quiet intensity that held the room. "We've lost more than cattle now. We lost Rusty. Next, it'll be a child, a wife. It's only a matter of time." His words hung heavy in the air, a truth they all knew but dreaded to voice. Jed Cooper, humbled by the terror, spoke next, his voice less fiery, more earnest. "The law ain't gonna save us from this. They'd laugh us out of the courthouse. We need someone who don't laugh at nightmares." His eyes, usually so quick to challenge, now held a glint of genuine vulnerability. A silence fell, thick and expectant. Every mind in the room was reaching for the same name, a legend whispered across saloons and campfires, a name that carried the weight of absolute resolve and unerring skill. Finally, Martha Thorne, her practical mind grasping the gravity of their situation, broke the quiet. "There's only one man," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "One man who's face down worse than most men can imagine. The papers call him Wild Bill Hickok." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Wild Bill Hickok. The very name conjured images of lightning-fast draws, unflappable courage, and a reputation that preceded him from Kansas to California. He was a gunslinger, yes, but also a lawman, a man of justice who didn't flinch from the darkest corners of the West. If anyone could confront a hairy devil, it was him. The decision was unanimous. Elias, with his steady hand, took up a quill and a fresh sheet of paper. His brow furrowed in concentration as he penned the desperate plea, each word chosen with care to convey the gravity of their situation without sounding like madmen. He described the torn cattle, the terrifying howls, the whispered legends. He implored Hickok, as a man of justice and a legend, to come to their aid. Jed, for all his hot-headedness, offered to ride, but Elias insisted on a younger, faster rider, a quiet boy named Caleb, known for his stamina and discretion. The letter, folded and sealed, felt impossibly heavy in Caleb's hand. He was young, barely out of his teens, and the responsibility weighed on him. He knew the dangers of the trail, the vast, unforgiving landscape between Deadwood and wherever Hickok might be. But the fear in the eyes of his community, the silent desperation, spurred him onward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hills in long, ominous shadows, Caleb mounted his swiftest horse. He paused only for a moment, glancing back at the dimming lights of the settlement, a beacon of fear and fragile hope. Then, with a quiet determination, he nudged his horse forward, disappearing into the vast, darkening expanse, carrying the desperate plea of a terrified people towards the one man who might just be able to save them. The hope of Deadwood now rode on his lone silhouette. Current word count, 2755. 3 days and 2 nights later, Caleb's weary horse finally stumbled into the bustling, chaotic heart of another frontier town, its main street a symphony of saloon pianos, raucous laughter, and the distant clatter of poker chips. He found Wild Bill Hickok exactly where rumor placed him, at the Golden Nugget Saloon, seated at a corner table, a half-empty glass of amber liquid before him. Hickok himself was an enigma. He wasn't the boisterous, swaggering figure many expected. Instead, he possessed a quiet intensity, a stillness that made every head turn without knowing why. His buckskin coat, fringed and worn, seemed to absorb the light, making him appear even more understated. His long, fair hair, usually flowing freely, was tied back neatly, revealing a face honed by a lifetime of close calls and hard decisions. His eyes, though, were what held you. a pale, startling blue, keen and cold, missing nothing. As Caleb, still covered in the dust of the trail, approached his table, a small skirmish erupted near the bar. Two burly prospectors, fueled by cheap whiskey and a dispute over a gold claim, were squaring off, fists clenched. One reached for a knife. Before the blade could clear its sheath, Hickok's left hand, seemingly without effort, moved. It didn't go for a gun. It simply intercepted the prospector's wrist with a speed that defied the eye, fingers locking around it like steel bands. A quiet word, too low for Caleb to hear, was uttered. The prospector's face, contorted with rage moments before, paled. His knife hand went limp. Hickok released him, his blue eyes holding the man's, a silent warning passing between them. The prospector stumbled back, mumbled an apology, and the tension diffused, replaced by a nervous hush. The man hadn't even drawn his weapon, yet the entire saloon understood the message. Caleb approached, reverence and desperation mingling in his voice. "Mr. Hickok, I have a letter. From Deadwood." Hickok's gaze, unblinking, shifted from the lingering tension at the bar to Caleb. He took the folded paper, his fingers brushing the boy's. The simple touch conveyed a startling calm. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning Elias Vance's carefully penned words. As he read, his expression remained unreadable, only the faintest tightening around his jaw betraying any internal reaction. The story of torn cattle, terrifying howls, and local legends flowed across the page. It wasn't the usual tale of outlaws or card cheats. This was different. A lifetime of confronting the savage and the wicked had forged Hickok into a man who rarely flinched. He'd stared down the barrel of countless guns, faced desperate men and insurmountable odds, but a hairy devil of the hills, a beast immune to lead. It stirred something in him, a challenge to his very understanding of the West. Yet there was no fear, only a cold, calculating resolve. Justice was justice, whether it wore a sombrero or had glowing eyes. The ranchers were desperate, abandoned by traditional law. Their plea, raw and honest, resonated with his own code. He folded the letter neatly and tucked it into his inner coat pocket. His eyes met Caleb's, an unspoken promise passing between them. "Tell them," Hickok said, his voice a low, even rumble. "I'll be there." The words carried a weight of certainty that instantly eased the knots in Caleb's chest. The legend had heard their call, and he had accepted. Wild Bill Hickok wasted no time. The Deadwood plea, a strange anomaly in his usual fare of human disputes, had ignited a cold spark of purpose within him. This wasn't a manhunt, but something far older, far more primal. He knew he couldn't face the unknown alone, not if the old-timers' whispers held even a shred of truth. He needed eyes and ears beyond his own, men who understood the language of the wilderness and possessed a different kind of courage. His first stop was a remote trapping cabin, barely more than a lean-to hidden deep in a secluded valley. There he found Silas Blackwood, the grizzled prospector from Elias's town, a man who had seen more of the wild's hidden truths than most. Silas, his face etched with a lifetime of sun and worry, was initially hesitant. "Heard the rumors, Bill," he rasped, his eyes narrow. "Sounds like trouble even you ain't meant for." But Hickok's calm, unwavering gaze and the quiet assurance in his voice slowly chipped away at Silas's doubt. He spoke of Deadwood's desperation, of the utter helplessness. Silas eventually nodded, picking up his worn but formidable hunting rifle. "All right, Bill. If you're fool enough to chase shadows, I suppose I'm fool enough to watch your back. But I ain't seen anything like this beast they talk about." Next, Hickok sought out Finn O'Malley, a young, ambitious sharpshooter barely out of his teens, whose reputation with a rifle was growing fast, though still far from Hickok's own. Finn was at a shooting range on the edge of town, practicing his aim, his movements quick and precise. He practically vibrated with youthful energy and a deep-seated admiration for Hickok. When Bill approached him with the proposition, Finn's eyes widened with a mix of awe and eager anticipation. "A monster, you say, Mr. Hickok? Like the stories?" He tried to sound brave, but the tremor in his voice was evident. Hickok merely nodded. For Finn, this was a chance to prove himself, to ride alongside a living legend. His skill with a rifle, even if conventional bullets proved useless, would be a valuable asset in a chaotic fight. Finally, Hickok visited the quiet encampment of Chayton, the Lakota elder. He approached with respect, a gesture not often afforded by white men of his stature. Chayton, seated by a slow-burning fire, looked at Hickok with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of generations. Hickok spoke plainly of the hairy devil, omitting no gruesome detail. Chayton listened, his face impassive, then spoke in a low, rhythmic voice about ancient spirits, about things that walk between worlds, things that taste of blood and shadows. He warned of the beast's cunning, its unnatural strength, and the futility of common lead. He also spoke of specific vulnerabilities, of sacred metals and the spirit of the land. Hickok, despite his pragmatic nature, listened intently. He respected Chayton's deep connection to the earth and its hidden truths. After a long silence, Chayton nodded. "I will guide you," he said, his gaze meeting Hickok's. "This thing, it does not belong." The small group assembled at dawn. Hickok, cold and composed. Silas, grizzled and wary. Finn, eager but visibly nervous. And Chayton, silent and observant, his knowledge a deep well. They were an unlikely band, brought together by an impossible threat. As they stood together, their horses saddled, their weapons ready, the air thrummed with a nervous energy. The details of the attacks recounted in low tones were sobering. Rusty's disappearance, the sheer scale of the carnage, the strange, unsettling howl. Each revelation tightened the knot of apprehension. Some doubts were voiced, particularly from Finn, about the sanity of facing such a foe. But one look at Hickok's unflappable face, his absolute certainty in their mission, quelled the nascent fears. He was the anchor in the gathering storm. The departure from the town was not one of fanfare or cheering crowds. Word of Hickok's unusual mission had spread, and it had sown a different kind of awe amongst the townsfolk, a silent, fearful respect for the legendary lawman. They gathered in hushed groups along the dusty main street, watching the small, grim procession prepare to ride out. Martha Thorne, her face lined with a fresh layer of worry, personally saw to their provisions. She packed dried meats, hardtack, coffee beans, and a generous supply of medical bandages. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed a canvas bag to Silas, her eyes meeting his with a silent plea for caution. "May God go with you, Mr. Hickok," she whispered, her voice barely audible as he nodded his acknowledgement. She knew the wilderness claimed many, but this venture felt uniquely perilous. Elias Vance and Jed Cooper stood shoulder to shoulder, their hats clutched in their hands. They watched Hickok, Silas, Finn, and Chayton mount their horses. For Elias, it was a profound mix of relief and renewed dread. Relief, because help had finally come, and it was the best help available. Dread, because the aid itself confirmed the impossibility of their plight. He knew what lurked out there, and the image of old Bessie's butchered form was a constant, sickening presence in his mind. Jed, too, looked less like the hot-headed youth, and more like a man burdened by an immense weight. He nodded to Hickok, a silent gesture of desperate hope and profound thanks. The sky, still pale with the early morning light, stretched out vast and indifferent above them. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. But as the small group turned their horses away from the last vestiges of civilization, heading towards the dark looming line of the forest, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of the town, the creak of a wagon wheel, the distant bleat of a goat, the murmur of worried voices, began to fade. Chayton, ever observant, paused for a moment at the edge of the tree line, his eyes sweeping the silent, ancient woods. He could feel the pulse of the earth, the stirring of unseen forces. Silas tightened his grip on his rifle, a grim set to his jaw. Finn, for all his eagerness, swallowed hard, the magnitude of their quest truly settling in as the familiar world receded behind them. Even Hickok, usually impassive, cast a final long look back at the diminishing lights of the settlement, a silent acknowledgement of the fear and faith they carried on their shoulders. Then, with a gentle nudge of the reins, he led his team forward. The horses' hooves muffled by the pine needles, they entered the vast, shadowy embrace of the thick woods. The sunlight, once bright, now struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The mundane world, with its predictable dangers, was left behind. They had crossed the threshold. Ahead lay the special world of the story, a place where legends were born not just from man, but from the unspeakable terrors that still lurked in the untamed heart of the West. The silent trees swallowed them whole, leaving only a faint dust trail and a lingering scent of determination mixed with dread. The moment they entered the thick woods, the world shifted. It wasn't just the diminished light, or the cool, damp air that clung to their skin. It was a profound change in atmosphere. The forest wasn't merely quiet, it was oppressively silent, as if holding its breath. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath their horses' hooves seemed amplified, echoing through the dense canopy like gunshots. The pines, ancient and towering, formed a suffocating wall, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sky and creating an endless labyrinth of shadow and distorted shapes. Silas Blackwood, the tracker, led the way, his eyes scanning the forest floor with the practiced intensity of a bloodhound. He was a master of reading signs, but even he moved with a newfound caution. "No game trails here," he murmured, his voice low, almost swallowed by the silence. "Creatures usually avoid this patch, too dark, too still." His words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the unnatural stillness. They followed the faint, almost invisible trail of blood and churned earth that Elias had first discovered. It was intermittent, often swallowed by patches of moss or scattered leaves, a frustratingly elusive breadcrumb trail left by a monster that moved with terrifying efficiency. As they delved deeper, they found more gruesome evidence of the beast's kills. Splintered saplings where a fleeing animal had been brought down, patches of dried, almost black blood on rocks, and the sickening, musky scent Elias had described, now stronger, more pervasive. It was the smell of death, but with an unsettling, unfamiliar edge to it. Finn O'Malley, usually boisterous, had grown quiet. His gaze darted nervously between the shadows, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his rifle. He jumped at the sudden flight of a startled crow, his face paling slightly. "You ever seen anything like this, Mr. Hickok?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hickok, riding steadily behind Silas, his eyes keen and unblinking, merely shook his head. "Not quite," he admitted, his voice flat. He was observant, absorbing every detail. The inexplicable lack of tracks, the sheer destructive force evident in the broken trees, the pervasive, chilling silence that muted even the natural sounds of the forest. He relied on logic and honed instinct, but this situation grated against his every experience. Chayton, the Lakota elder, rode at the rear, his presence a calm, stoic anchor. He spoke rarely, but his eyes, dark and ancient, seemed to see beyond the physical world. He occasionally pointed to a disturbed patch of earth, a broken branch too high for a bear, or a strange scratch on a tree bark that Silas confirmed wasn't from a natural claw. His quiet observations added another layer to the chilling mystery, suggesting an intelligence, a cunning, that went beyond simple animal instinct. As twilight descended, deepening the shadows to impenetrable ink, they chose a small, relatively open clearing for camp. No fire, not yet. They couldn't risk attracting the attention of their prey, which was more likely hunting them. They ate cold rations, their senses strained, listening to every rustle. Sleep was a luxury they couldn't truly afford. Every creak of the old trees sounded like approaching footsteps, every distant hoot of an owl like a guttural warning. The moon, a sliver of light filtering through the dense canopy, offered little comfort, only emphasizing the profound, terrifying darkness that surrounded them. Each man felt the unseen eyes of the wilderness upon them, and the unsettling certainty that something was out there, watching, waiting. The hunt was on, but it felt as if they were the ones being stalked. The next day dawned with the same oppressive silence, broken only by the crunch of pine needles beneath their boots. They continued their grim tracking, the air thick with the scent of pine and the lingering, unsettling musk of the unseen predator. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees older, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like ancient, grasping fingers. Silas, ever vigilant, suddenly stopped. He knelt beside a small patch of damp earth near a trickling stream. "Look here," he whispered, pointing. There were prints, unmistakable, deep impressions in the soft soil. They were large, larger than any wolf, bigger than even a mountain lion. But they were oddly shaped, long, almost too narrow for their size, with an unsettling resemblance to a bare human foot, though monstrously oversized and ending in what looked like blunt, clawed toes. And then, terrifyingly, just a few feet away, the print shifted. It was now clearly a massive paw, powerful and wide, with distinct claw marks, but still far too large for any known beast. "It shifts," Silas breathed, his voice laced with a tremor of awe and dread. "From one thing to another." The revelation sent a cold shiver through Finn. "What in God's name?" he began, his voice choked. Hickok merely stared, his eyes narrowed, absorbing the impossible evidence. His pragmatic mind struggled to reconcile what he saw with what he knew. This was beyond the realm of wild animals or human bandits. As they pressed on, the signs grew more explicit, more disturbing. They found a clearing, oddly devoid of undergrowth, where a large, splintered branch thick as a man's thigh lay snapped clean through, as if by immense, sudden force. Further on, tangled in a thorny bush, they discovered a small, bloodied piece of fabric. It was dark, coarsely woven, and stained with dried blood. This was not the fur of a lost animal. It was clearly from a human garment, suggesting a victim they hadn't known about, a silent casualty absorbed by the wilderness. The realization hit them hard. The beast wasn't just preying on livestock. It had claimed human life, perhaps recently, and unseen by the terrified townsfolk. The stakes had just soared. Chayton, who had been moving with a quiet intensity, suddenly halted. His gaze was fixed on a cluster of ancient oaks. He pointed to a tree, its bark deeply scarred, not by lightning, not by a bear. These were deep, parallel gashes, incredibly long, as if a colossal razor-sharp hand had raked down the trunk with incredible force. "A sharpening post," Chayton murmured, his voice hushed. "For its claws. This is its hunting ground." His words hung in the air, a chilling implication of the creature's intelligence and its established dominion over this part of the forest. This was no fleeting presence. This was its territory. Near the base of the scarred oak, a faint, almost invisible den was partially hidden amongst thick roots and fallen leaves. It was large, dark, and emanated that same unsettling, musky odor. It was clearly the creature's lair, but it was empty, a dark, gaping maw in the earth. The beast was not here, it was out, moving, hunting, or perhaps watching them. The realization that their enemy was not only unnatural but also cunning, capable of shifting form and claiming human lives, sent a fresh wave of dread through the group. Finn's hands trembled slightly as he rechecked his rifle. Silas looked grim. Even Hickok, for all his composure, felt a cold knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. They were no longer just tracking a monster. They were in its hunting ground, and it knew they were there. The sense of being watched intensified, a prickling awareness on the back of their necks, and the dark woods seemed to close in around them, whispering unseen threats. The tension in the air was a living thing, a palpable weight pressing down on them with every step. The revelations of the shifting prints, the human fabric, and the scarred trees had solidified the terrifying truth. They were hunting a creature of nightmare, not flesh and blood as they understood it. The silence of the forest, once merely oppressive, now felt predatory, as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting. They moved slowly, meticulously, each man a coiled spring. Chayton led them towards a series of rocky ridges, ancient formations that jutted out from the dense forest, offering sporadic higher vantage points. The plan was simple: try to spot the beast before it spotted them, to gain some understanding of its movements, its habits. They climbed carefully, their boots scraping on loose shale, the sound magnified in the unnatural quiet. The sun, a pale disk in the distant sky, cast long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping claws across the uneven terrain. As they neared the summit of one such ridge, a sudden sharp crack echoed through the stillness below. Not a branch snapping from wind. This was deliberate. Too loud for an animal, too forceful. Hickok raised a hand, freezing the group. Every man instinctively dropped to a crouch, rifles raised, eyes scanning the dense tree line below. The air grew impossibly still, as if the forest itself held its breath. Then, a faint rustle, a deeper sound of movement through the undergrowth, impossible for its perceived size to move so quietly. And then they saw it. It was fleeting, a terrifying fragment of a nightmare. A colossal shadow, darker than the deepest night, detached itself from the dense foliage below. It moved with an impossible speed and grace, a blur of immense power. For a split second it crossed a sliver of moonlight that had pierced the canopy. Its fur, as black as a moonless void, seemed to drink the light. And then, its eyes. 2 points of intense, malevolent luminescence glowing like live coals in the darkness, fixed directly on them. The sheer size, the unnatural speed, the raw, unbridled malice radiating from those glowing orbs, it was beyond anything their minds could have conceived. Finn O'Malley, for all his youthful bravado, couldn't suppress a sharp, involuntary gasp. It was a small sound, but in the profound silence it was like a thunderclap. The colossal shadow paused, a massive head swiveling towards them, those burning eyes momentarily locked onto their position. "Hold!" Hickok's voice was a low, guttural command, barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the rising terror. Finn, his finger twitching on the trigger, instinctively obeyed, his face pale as death. He could have sworn he saw a dark, knowing glint in those fiery eyes. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the monstrous shape vanished, melting back into the shadows of the deep woods. No sound, no breaking branches, just a ripple in the fabric of the darkness, gone. It left behind only the crushing weight of its presence, the lingering scent of something wild and foul, and the profound, chilling realization of what they were truly up against. They remained frozen for a long moment, hearts hammering against their ribs. The glimpse had been terrifyingly brief, yet devastatingly clear. This was no beast of legend. It was a living, breathing nightmare, more powerful and cunning than any of them could have imagined. Hickok's face, usually so calm, was etched with a grim determination. The hunt had changed. They were no longer the hunters, they were the bait. The terrifying glimpse of the hairy devil had shifted the very ground beneath their feet. The beast was real, unimaginably powerful, and now it knew they were here. The hunter had become the hunted. They retreated from the ridge, a profound sense of vulnerability settling upon them. They moved with desperate stealth, the forest now feeling less like a challenge and more like a vast, dark prison. They found a small, rocky overhang to make a desperate, concealed camp. Sleep was a luxury, fear a constant companion. The air itself seemed to thrum with the monster's presence, a low, unnerving hum that vibrated in their very bones. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, brought their rifles up, their eyes darting into the oppressive shadows. The attack, when it came, was sudden, brutal and swift, a terrifying blur of fur and claws. It was just after midnight. A sliver of the moon had finally pierced the canopy, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the forest floor. Silas, restless, had just begun to stir, his old bones aching when a guttural snarl, deep and primal, exploded from the darkness only feet away. Before anyone could react, a colossal black shape launched itself from the shadows, a living, howling engine of pure destruction. It slammed into Finn O'Malley, who had been on watch, sending him flying like a rag doll. A scream, brief and agonizing, tore from his throat. The creature didn't pause. It was a whirlwind of black fur and razor-sharp claws, a force of nature unleashed. The sound of rending cloth, then tearing flesh, filled the air. "Fire!" Hickok roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. His own peacemaker was already in his hand, a blur of polished steel. Bullets erupted, flashes of orange light tearing through the darkness, followed by the deafening crack of rifle fire. Hickok, Silas, and even Chayton, whose ancient rifle barked with surprising ferocity, poured lead into the attacking monstrosity. The bullets struck, loud thwacks against solid muscle and bone, but they seemed to have no effect. The beast roared, a sound of fury and annoyance, not pain. It was a chilling realization the lead was useless. It only seemed to enrage the creature, making its attacks more savage, its movements more frantic. One shot from Hickok's pistol, aimed true at its chest, merely caused it to flinch, an almost casual shrug of its massive shoulders, before it lunged again. Finn, bleeding profusely, struggled to rise, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended fear. The monster turned on him again, its glowing eyes fixed on his prone form. Hickok, without a thought, launched himself forward, firing another shot not at the beast, but into the ground just beside it, a desperate attempt to draw its attention. The creature roared, momentarily distracted. This gave Silas just enough time to drag Finn, whose leg was a mangled mess, deeper into the meager cover of the rocks. Chayton, moving with surprising agility, threw a handful of dried herbs into a small, smoldering ember, creating a thick, pungent smoke that briefly disoriented the beast. The fight was brutal and chaotic, a desperate struggle for survival against an unstoppable force. The air filled with the stench of blood, gunpowder, and the creature's musky, terrifying odor. They were outmatched, their weapons useless. This was their lowest point. They had faced human adversaries, outlaws, and desperate men. But this was something else. This was a nightmare given flesh, and they were utterly helpless against it. The dark woods seemed to mock their efforts, reverberating with the monster's roars and the futile echoes of their gunfire. They were trapped, hunted, and running out of time. The retreat was agonizing. They dragged Finn, moaning softly, his leg a ruin, back into the deepest shadows of their makeshift camp. The monster, having terrorized them, had melted back into the night as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving behind a chilling silence punctuated only by Finn's pained whimpers and the rapid thumping of their own hearts. The pungent smoke from Chayton's herbs slowly dissipated, but the terror lingered, thick and suffocating. Hickok knelt beside Finn, assessing the damage. The wound was horrific, deep and ragged, bone likely shattered. Silas, grim-faced, quickly applied a tourniquet, his old hands surprisingly gentle. "He'll bleed out if we don't get him help, Bill," Silas muttered, his voice raw. "And what's out there? It ain't done with us." The brutal truth hung in the air. Their bullets were useless. They had faced a creature of immense power, impervious to their lead. Hickok, for the first time in memory, felt a tremor of something akin to despair. He was a man of action, of decisive force. But what action could he take against this? He stared into the darkness, his mind racing, desperately searching for an answer where there seemed to be none. The old legends. Chayton's voice was a low rumble, breaking the silence. He sat cross-legged, observing the wounded Finn with a detached but not uncaring gaze. The ones who walk between worlds, they fear purity. They fear sacred metals, silver. Hickok's head snapped towards the elder. "Silver?" he repeated, the word sounding alien in his pragmatic mind. He dismissed it as superstition, the ramblings of old men and native lore. But now, with Finn bleeding out and their conventional methods proven useless, even the impossible glimmered with a desperate possibility. "My people have spoken of it for generations," Chayton continued, his voice calm. "A metal blessed by the moon, by the earth. It burns their flesh. It pierces their spirit." Silas, ever the realist, scoffed but without conviction. Old wives' tales, Chayton. We ain't got no silver bullets out here. Do we? Hickok's voice was tight, his eyes narrowing. He began to search his own possessions, a frantic desperation creeping into his composure. His belt buckle, too thick, his watch, gold-plated, the few coins in his pocket, copper, nickel, or regular silver, but none pure enough for such a task. Then, a thought. Finn, still semi-conscious, had a small, ornate locket around his neck, a gift from his mother, perhaps, visible beneath his torn shirt. It was a cheap thing, brass, but perhaps... Finn, Hickok said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Do you carry anything silver? Anything at all? Finn, through a haze of pain, mumbled, My grandmother's thimble. She said it was lucky. In my satchel. Hope, fragile but urgent, sparked in Hickok's eyes. A thimble. Small, yes, but pure. Enough, perhaps, for a single critical shot. But how to melt it? How to mold it into a bullet in the middle of a dark, hostile wilderness, with a wounded man bleeding out and a monster lurking? The task seemed impossible, yet it was their only thread, their only chance. Silas, seeing the desperate resolve in Hickok's eyes, began to rummage through their limited supplies. Got some old lead molds from a hunting trip, he grumbled, more to himself than anyone. And we could use Finn's small cooking pot for a crucible. Chayton nodded, his gaze distant, already envisioning the process, the ancient magic mingling with frontier ingenuity. A desperate plan began to form, a desperate gamble. They were stripped bare, forced to confront their deepest fears and wildest beliefs. They had to rely on something beyond their experience, something that challenged every ounce of their pragmatic Western logic. The chilling howls from earlier that night still echoed in their ears, a reminder of the creature's looming threat. But now, amidst the despair, a glimmer of an idea, a silver thread of hope, began to shimmer in the overwhelming darkness. Their lives, and the fate of Deadwood, depended on a single impossible bullet. The air in the makeshift camp crackled with a desperate, tense energy. Finn lay huddled under a blanket, his breathing shallow, Silas tending to his mangled leg with grim determination, doing what little he could. But all eyes, all thoughts, were focused on the small, flickering flame Hickok and Chayton had painstakingly coaxed from a handful of dry kindling and pine needles, carefully shielded by rocks to prevent any telltale glow. From Finn's satchel, Silas had retrieved the small, unassuming thimble. It was indeed solid silver, old and tarnished, an heirloom perhaps, imbued with the quiet history of a distant family. It felt impossibly light, yet held the weight of all their hopes. "We need heat," Chayton murmured, his face illuminated by the dancing firelight. "Enough to melt it quickly." Silas produced a small, durable cooking pot, blackened with years of camp use. It would serve as their crucible. Hickok, with his usual precise movements, used the flat of his knife to carefully shave small slivers of silver from the thimble, dropping them into the pot. The metal gleamed faintly in the low light. The process was agonizingly slow, a test of patience against the clock ticking for Finn's life, and the ever-present threat of the monster's return. They took turns blowing on the embers, feeding the small flame, trying to build enough heat. Sweat beaded on Hickok's brow, not from exertion, but from the immense pressure of the moment. He, the legendary gunslinger, was reduced to a blacksmith, relying on ancient superstition and a child's heirloom. As the silver slowly began to soften, then liquefy into a shimmering molten pool, Chayton worked quietly beside them. He crushed a handful of herbs and powders, whispering ancient words, infusing them with a silent blessing before adding them to the molten silver, a desperate mingling of frontier ingenuity and tribal mysticism. The mix hissed faintly, a wisp of pungent smoke rising into the night. Silas, meanwhile, found an old, half-used lead mold from his hunting pack. It was crude, meant for larger calibers, but with a bit of ingenuity and some steady hands, they might make it work. The plan was not to make a perfect bullet, but to coat an existing lead slug with the silver, ensuring enough contact to transfer its unique properties. The molten silver, gleaming dully, was poured carefully over a single lead bullet, one of Hickok's own. It cooled quickly, hardening into a misshapen but distinctly silver-coated slug. It wasn't pretty, wasn't polished, but it was there. One shot. Their only shot. While the bullet cooled, Silas, using his trapping knowledge, fashioned a rudimentary diversion. He used dried leaves and a small, squeaking animal call, intending to draw the beast's attention to a different part of the forest, giving Hickok a brief, precious window for a clean shot. The tension was almost unbearable. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every distant sound became a prelude to attack. Hickok held the silver bullet in his hand. It was cold, strangely heavy, and utterly alien. This wasn't about skill or speed now. It was about faith in the improbable. His legendary aim had always been his weapon, but now, his weapon itself was an act of belief. He looked at the pale, unconscious Finn, then at the grim faces of Silas and Chayton. This was their desperate gamble, their last resort against the timber terror. The night pressed in around them, dark and unforgiving, but now, a fragile flicker of hope, born of molten silver and ancient whispers, held them together. The choice of battlefield was deliberate. Chayton had guided them to a narrow, rocky defile nestled between two steep forested ridges, a natural choke point. The limited space would restrict the monster's impossible speed and allow for a more concentrated fire. Dawn was a long way off, the moon hanging high and bright, bathing the clearing in an ethereal, almost eerie glow. The air was cold, crisp, and charged with an electric tension. Hickok, cold and composed as ever, stood at the bottleneck, the single silver-coated bullet loaded into the chamber of his prized peacemaker. Silas, with his hunting rifle, and Chayton, with his ancient firearm, positioned themselves on the rocky ledges above, flanking Hickok. Finn, too weak to move, lay hidden deeper within the rocks, a silent, desperate prayer on his lips. Silence, the most terrifying sound in the wilderness. It stretched, taut and suffocating, until the only sound was the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They waited, their nerves stretched to breaking point, every sense alive to the smallest disturbance. Then, a low growl, vibrating from the very earth beneath their feet, shattered the stillness. It came from the deepest part of the defile, the monster announcing its arrival. A moment later, a colossal shadow, even more terrifying in the stark moonlight than in their brief glimpse, launched itself into the clearing. It was the werewolf, colossal, with fur as black as coal, eyes that blazed with malevolent, fiery light, and massive, ripping claws. It moved with a primal, savage grace, a living engine of destruction, its howls echoing like thunder off the canyon walls. It was fury unleashed, a force of nature twisted into a nightmare. Now! Hickok's voice, a whip crack in the night, cut through the monster's roar. Silas and Chayton opened fire from above, their lead bullets thudding harmlessly against the creature's immense bulk, sparking off its fur. It roared, annoyed, its glowing eyes momentarily diverted. This was the diversion. Hickok stood his ground, a lone figure in the face of absolute terror. He raised his peacemaker, his arm steady, his eye fixed on the approaching behemoth. The monster, having momentarily registered the nuisance of the bullets, turned its full, horrifying attention back to the man who stood defiantly in its path. It covered the distance in a few terrifying bounds, its gaping maw revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, its claws extended. Hickok didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He waited until the last possible second, until the monster was upon him, its hot, foul breath washing over his face. He saw the fury in its eyes, felt the ground tremble beneath its massive weight, and then, with his unerring aim, with the cold precision born of 1,000 duels, he fired. The gunshot cracked through the night, deafening. The single silver bullet, charged with their desperate hope and Chayton's blessing, flew true. It struck the creature square in the chest, right over its black, heaving heart. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The werewolf didn't just flinch or roar. A shriek of pure, agonizing torment tore from its throat, a sound of unspeakable agony and primal shock. Its glowing eyes, moments before filled with malevolence, widened in an expression of profound, unbearable pain. Black smoke, impossibly, seemed to curl from the wound where the silver had penetrated. The creature thrashed, a monstrous flailing mass of fur and claws, biting at the air, its roars now laced with howls of utter anguish. It stumbled, legs buckling, a gargantuan dying scream ripping from its lungs as it finally collapsed. It fell with a sickening thud, howling its last tortured breath over the hallowed sacred ground of the western wilderness. The battle was over. The timber terror was vanquished. Silence, deeper and more absolute than before, descended once more. Only the lingering scent of ozone from the gunshot and the coppery tang of the monster's blood remained. The silence that followed the werewolf's final, agonizing howl was profound, ringing in their ears with an almost surreal quality. It wasn't the oppressive, watchful silence of moments before, but the quiet of something truly broken. Hickok lowered his peacemaker, the silver bullet smoke still curling from its barrel. His hand, for the briefest of moments, trembled. Silas and Chayton cautiously descended from their perches, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and profound awe. They approached the fallen beast slowly, their rifles still at the ready, as if expecting it to rise again. The werewolf lay sprawled, an immense, terrifying heap of coal-black fur and twisted limbs. Its glowing eyes had faded to a dull, lifeless gray. The wound in its chest where the silver had struck still smoked faintly, a raw, burning crater in its thick hide. Even in death, its size and grotesque form were overwhelming, a chilling testament to the nightmare they had just faced. It was undeniably dead, yet its mere presence still sent shivers down their spines. "By God," Silas breathed, his voice hoarse. "I never believed it." He kicked at a massive paw, confirming the lack of life. The relief was palpable, a wave washing over them, almost making their legs buckle. They were alive. Finn, though badly wounded, was still breathing shallowly. "It cannot remain," Chayton stated, his voice firm, his gaze fixed on the beast. "Its evil must be cleansed. The land must be purified." He spoke of ancient rites, of preventing its spirit from lingering, from haunting these woods. They set about the grim task. Dragging the colossal carcass was an immense effort, its weight unimaginable. They hauled it to the center of a wide clearing, away from the dry underbrush. Then, with methodical precision, they began to gather wood, dry branches, fallen logs, anything that would burn. Silas, with his years in the wilderness, knew how to build a pyre that would consume such a mass. Chayton added dried herbs and sacred cedar boughs, muttering quiet blessings to the land, asking for forgiveness and cleansing. As the moon began its slow descent towards the western horizon, they lit the pyre. The flames licked greedily at the dry wood, rising quickly, casting flickering, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the earlier terror. The heat was immense, forcing them back. The scent of pine and burning wood mingled with the acrid smell of burning fur and something else, something metallic and foul, the stench of ancient evil being consumed. The flames roared, a cleansing roar climbing higher and higher, transforming the monstrous form into ash and smoke. It was a ritual of vanquishment, a final definitive act against the terror that had plagued Deadwood. Under the watchful, now peaceful moonlight, the monster's terror was burned away, banished from the sacred land of the West. The ride back to Deadwood was a stark contrast to their grim journey into the wilderness. The silence of the forest still clung to them, but now it felt different, less menacing, more like a quiet witness to their impossible triumph. The sky was a pale, hopeful blue, and the rising sun, no longer obscured by the oppressive canopy, warmed their exhausted bodies. Hickok led the way, his face still etched with the grim lines of their ordeal, but his eyes held a new quiet depth. Behind him rode Silas, weary but resolute, and Chayton, stoic as ever, his wisdom now undeniably proven. Finn, wrapped in blankets, was lashed carefully to a makeshift litter between two horses, tended to by Silas. He was alive, though feverish, his life hanging by a thread, a stark reminder of the cost of their victory. As they emerged from the tree line and the familiar open expanse of the Deadwood outskirts came into view, a few early rising ranchers spotted them. A cry went up, quickly echoed by others. News traveled fast in the small community, and word of Hickok's departure had fueled an anxious vigil. Hesitation rippled through the onlookers first. Had they succeeded? Were there more monsters? Then, seeing the grim determination on Hickok's face, the exhausted but victorious posture of Silas and Chayton, and the conspicuous absence of the monstrous shadows that had plagued their nights, relief erupted. A wave of sound swelled from the settlement. Shouts, cheers, a collective sigh of release that reverberated across the plains. The community rushed forward, a mix of fear and gratitude on their faces. Elias Vance and Jed Cooper were among the first to reach them, their eyes scanning the weary faces for confirmation. Elias saw Finn and his own face, already pale, tightened with concern, but then he looked into Hickok's cold, clear blue eyes. There was a story in those depths, a tale of unimaginable horror faced and overcome. "Is it?" Elias started, his voice barely a whisper. Hickok simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. "It's done, Elias. The hairy devil is no more." His voice was low, tired, but carried an absolute certainty that banished all doubt. A collective cheer, louder and more heartfelt than any before, burst forth from the crowd. Women openly wept, men clapped each other on the back, relief washing over them in a powerful tide. The wounded Finn was quickly, gently carried into Martha Thorne's store, where the kind proprietor, tears in her eyes, immediately began to prepare hot water and clean bandages. The returning heroes, grim and exhausted, were led through the jubilant crowd. They were no longer just men. They were men who had stared into the abyss of the unknown and returned. The air thrummed with a mixture of profound gratitude and a newfound, almost sacred respect for the legend who walked among them. They were safe, and a new kind of awe for Hickok, the man who dared to face a monster that defied the very laws of their world, was born. The terror was gone, but the memory of its shadow and the legend of its vanquisher would forever linger in the Deadwood wilderness.